low amber light of a fading Pleistocene sun cuts across the wind-scoured steppe, throwing long, exaggerated shadows behind a small band of hominids huddled along the tree line. Pop culture has long indulged in a crude, convenient caricature of these early ancestors, bent-backed brutes lumbering across the tundra, dragging heavy clubs, tearing at raw marrow, and communicating through an erratic series of mindless grunts, guttural barks, and feral shrieks. It is a portrait born of Victorian bias and Hollywood simplicity. But evolutionary biology reveals a truth that is infinitely more refined, demanding, and magnificent. A creature that relied on random, discordant noise would not have survived a single winter in the Middle and Late Pleistocene ecosystems. The margin between survival and extinction was razor thin. It was measured in the ability to transmit exact, high-stakes information across space and time. The subtle direction of a shifting wind, the structural weakness in a mammoth's flank, the seasonal toxicity of a swollen root, the precise angle required to strike a core of obsidian, and the complex web of social debts and alliances that kept a band from tearing itself apart. The foundational riddle of human origins is not why our ancestors made noise, but how an animal grounded in silent physical pantomime gradually transformed the acoustic physics of its own respiratory system into the most complex communication engine the natural world has ever witnessed. To understand the emergence of the human voice, one must look deep beneath the weathered flesh, beneath the heavy supraorbital brow ridges and the muscular jaw lines, to witness a silent anatomical revolution millions of years in the making. At the center of this transformation lies a minute floating structure, the hyoid bone. Unlike every other bone in the human skeleton, the hyoid is completely isolated from the rest of the skeletal architecture. Suspended delicately in the soft tissue beneath the mandible and above the thyroid cartilage, it acts as a floating scaffold, anchored solely by a dynamic network of muscles and ligaments extending from the base of the skull, the tongue, the pharynx, and the sternum. In non-human primates and early Australopithecines, the hyoid was anchored high in the neck and possessed an expansive bulla that housed resonant laryngeal air sacs, structures capable of producing booming territorial calls, but wholly incapable of the rapid, subtle articulatory shifts required for speech. Over hundreds of thousands of years, as hominids adapted to obligate bipedalism, the base of the cranium underwent a profound spatial reorganization known as basicranial flexion. The skull rotated atop an upright vertebral column, driving the larynx, the voice box, downward into the throat. In chimpanzees, the larynx sits elevated high behind the jaw, allowing them to drink and breathe simultaneously, but severely restricting the space inside the pharynx. In the emerging genus Homo, the descent of the larynx created an expansive two-chambered acoustic resonator cavity, dividing the vocal tract into two segments of roughly equal length, the horizontal oral cavity and the vertical pharyngeal cavity. This right-angled dual resonator system was an evolutionary gambit of extraordinary risk. By lowering the larynx, our ancestors exposed themselves to the constant and potentially lethal danger of choking on food. Natural selection would never have preserved such a hazardous structural vulnerability unless the selective advantage it conferred was immense. That advantage was the ability to modulate acoustic formant frequencies with unprecedented agility, enabling the clean, distinct separation of universal vowel spaces, such as the crisp sounds of A, I, and U, without the muffling acoustic overlap found in other primates. This anatomical capability was not unique to modern Homo sapiens. When researchers unearthed the fossilized skeleton of a Neanderthal at Kaba Cave in the Levant, they recovered a 60,000-year-old hyoid bone that was virtually indistinguishable in size, mass, and biomechanical geometry from that of a living human. Biomechanical modeling demonstrates that the Neanderthal hyoid was subjected to the exact same micromechanical stress vectors as our own, anchored to a tongue that possessed the precision, muscular velocity, and flexibility to shape complex phonemes. Furthermore, fossilized Neanderthal skulls revealed wide thoracic vertebral canals, which carried heavy bundles of nerve fibers down to the intercostal muscles of the chest. This neural highway allowed for the sub-millisecond control of breathing pressure, a physiological prerequisite for pacing out long, sustained vocal bursts without collapsing the lungs. Even the microscopic bones of their inner ears, the malleus, incus, and stakes, were tuned through natural selection to match the precise acoustic frequency spectrum of human speech, between 2 and 4 kilohertz, ensuring that the sounds their throats were capable of producing were the exact frequencies their companions' ears were optimized to hear. Zooming into the face of a hunter crouching in the freezing scrub reveals the living mechanics of this ancient machinery in action. The skin of his face is thick, weathered with wind, and dusted with the charcoal ash of last night's hearth. His brow is heavy, but his eyes are sharply focused, carrying a deep, calculating intelligence. His mouth sits slightly ajar. Beneath the chapped lips, the orbicularis oris and buccinator muscles draw taut across his cheekbones, pulling the mouth into deliberate microspatial configurations. As he monitors the distant movement of game, his heavy jaw shifts. The tongue, a dense mass of intrinsic muscular fibers, flexes inside the oral chamber, striking the hard palate behind his front teeth with subtle, damp clicks. He is not screaming, he is testing the air, shaping small, localized pressures within his mouth, feeling the precise tactile resistance of his palate against his tongue. His throat visibly bobs as the descended larynx moves in micro-increments, adjusting its vertical tension to prepare for the release of an intentional burst of acoustic energy. Yet, long before these anatomical chambers carried complex acoustic streams, the primary language of hominids was written in the air with the hands. The gestural theory of language illustrates that our ancestors communicated through a rich, intricate grammar of visual signs and pantomime millions of years before they relied on spoken words. Neurobiology confirms this deep evolutionary kinship. The region of the human brain responsible for speech production, Broca's area, Brodmann areas 44 and 45, is directly adjacent to and inexorably wired into the motor cortex regions that govern manual dexterity, finger movement, and precision hand gestures. When an ape gestures, it uses intentional, goal-directed motor planning that mirrors human neural activity far more closely than its involuntary emotional screams do. Hand gestures provided the initial, pliable symbolic matrix. An open palm held horizontally could represent a flat riverbed. Fingers curled into a claw could instantly evoke the curved talons of an eagle. A sudden downward chop of the forearm could trace the rapid descent of a hunting spear. Picture the hunt unfolding on the open savanna. 5 individuals stalk through tall, dry grass toward a solitary bull bison. The dry grass is a sensory trap. A single misplaced rustle or a panicked vocalization would scatter the herd instantly. The lead hunter freezes, sinking low onto his haunches. He does not utter a sound. Instead, his right arm raises slowly, fingers spread wide and rigid, a silent command for the line to halt. His wrist twists, tilting 2 fingers toward a ravine on the left, indicating that 2 hunters must peel off and establish an ambush vector. His other hand drops to the earth, fingers mimicking the slow, rhythmic cadence of a walking quadruped, before snapping his fist tightly closed. The animal has stopped moving. It is listening. Every hunter in the line decodes the complex syntactic instruction instantly, reading the spatial orientation of his fingers, the tension in his shoulders, and the deliberate direction of his gaze. For tens of thousands of generations, this silent visual lexicon was the supreme instrument of hominid survival. However, gesture carried insurmountable environmental limitations. You cannot see a hand sign in the pitch-black darkness of a cave or through the dense underbrush of a primeval forest. You cannot see a warning sign if your back is turned while butchering an animal. Most critically, as the lithic technologies of early humans advanced, from simple Oldowan choppers to finely bifaced Acheulean hand axes and complex Levallois blade cores, their hands became permanently occupied. An ancestor carrying a heavy stone core in one hand and a bone hammer in the other could no longer gesture with the fluidity required to convey urgent concepts. The hands were busy working, cutting, carrying, scraping, and killing. Driven by this intense ecological and technological pressure, the communicative burden inevitably migrated from the fingers to the vocal tract. The brain, having already developed the neural wiring for sequential, structured grammar within the motor circuits of Broca's area, began mapping those identical structural patterns into the floating muscles of the tongue, the velum, the lips, and the descending larynx. Sound inherited the mantle of gesture, turning the breath of the lungs into an agile, invisible tool that could cut through darkness, travel around physical obstacles, and leave the hands completely free to craft the material world. As the mist clears over a sun-drenched river basin, the camp stirs to life. Long before the emergence of nested subordinate clauses, recursive grammar, or abstract philosophy, our ancestors filled the morning air with a vibrant, textured acoustic tapestry, a rich and dynamic proto-language. To modern ears, conditioned to the rigid syntactic structures of contemporary speech, these vocalizations might have sounded raw, alien, and intensely visceral. Yet they were worlds away from the mindless, reactive screeching of animals. This was a deliberate, intentional linguistic system, a structured scaffolding of vocal symbols where isolated words, tonal modulations, and rhythmic cadences carried profound functional weight. Each vocal burst was tethered directly to the physical environment, carrying precise situational meaning that allowed the group to coordinate their movements, regulate internal conflicts, and process the immense challenges of a perilous landscape with remarkable collective intelligence. Close your eyes and focus on the face of an elder hominid seated beside the embers of a morning fire. The camera tightens on the rough, sun-hardened landscape of her features. Deep furrows radiate from the corners of her dark, alert eyes. The skin stretched across her broad zygomatic arches is taut and leathery. Her jaw is broad and robust, powered by massive masseter muscles that ripple beneath the flesh. Her lips, thick and mobile, pull back tightly against worn amber-colored teeth as she prepares to articulate a warning to a nearby juvenile. There is no casual laxity in her vocal production. The intrinsic muscles of her larynx contract with calculated precision, drawing the vocal folds together across the glottis to build subglottic air pressure from her broad, barrel-shaped chest. When the sound releases, it is not a flat monotone, but a complex, modulated acoustic event. Her voice is lower, raspier, and far more resonant than modern human speech, driven by the sheer acoustic volume of her deeper pharyngeal cavity. She uses pitch with dramatic, melodic, deliberate force. To warn the child away from a patch of thorny briars sheltering a nesting viper, she does not construct a multi-tiered sentence like, "Be careful not to step there because a snake is hiding." Instead, she pushes out a sharp, descending tonal burst, a sharp falling glide that begins in a high, piercing register and drops abruptly into a chest-resonating growl, instantly followed by a hard, unvoiced palatal click made by snapping the body of her muscular tongue violently away from the roof of her mouth. The acoustic contour alone communicates urgency, direction, and specific danger, freezing the juvenile in his tracks before his foot touches the brush. This tonal versatility formed the bedrock of early human interaction. In what evolutionary linguists often describe as a musical proto-language, early hominids relied extensively on prosodic contours, the musical rise, fall, stress, and rhythm of vocal output to encode emotional states, social hierarchies, and operational imperatives. A rising, lilting pitch could signal an open-ended inquiry or a friendly invitation to share warmth, while a rhythmic, low-frequency hum vibrating deep in the chest cavity served as a continuous contact call, an acoustic tether reassuring individuals moving through dense, blinding brush that the band remained nearby and secure.
The phonetic inventory of these early speakers likely made heavy use of non-pulmonic sounds, such as clicks, whistles, suction stops, and throat-clearing fricatives, similar to the complex phonologies found today in ancient indigenous click languages, like those of the San and Hadza peoples. A hunter perched on an overlook might signal the proximity of a water source with a soft bilabial pop, produced purely through air pressure trapped between the lips without engaging the lungs, allowing the information to travel clearly over short distances without alerting resting predators. Vocalization was deeply physical, an athletic coordination of the pharynx, velum, tongue blade, and facial musculature that turned the entire upper respiratory tract into an acoustic percussion instrument. Yet, despite this phonetic richness, the semantic world of early hominids remained strictly bounded by the concrete, immediate boundaries of the physical universe. Their vocabulary was a catalog of tangible objects, immediate actions, spatial vectors, and observable sensory phenomena. They possessed distinct phonetic markers for sharp stone, split bone, stagnant water, running track, heavy rain, and leopard shadow. They could combine these primary lexical units into functional linear strings: stone, sharp, here; bison, water, many; or fire, wood, bring. What they did not possess was the cognitive and syntactic machinery for recursive abstraction. They had no words for tomorrow, justice, destiny, possibility, or tradition. Time was not an abstract linear axis broken into calibrated units of hours, weeks, or centuries. It was the rising and setting of the sun, the swelling of the moon, the turning of the dry season into the rains, and the biological cycles of birth, migration, and rot. Their words lived entirely in the visible, audible, and tactile present. The ferocious evolutionary pressure that forced this concrete proto-language to expand was not merely the technical demand of the hunt, but the profound social complexity of the hominid band. In our closest living primate relatives, social harmony, political alliances, and emotional stability are maintained through physical grooming.
Grooming is an intimate, time-consuming tactile investment. One individual meticulously parts another's fur, picking out parasites, dirt, and dead skin, which stimulates the release of calming endorphins and cements bilateral loyalty. However, physical grooming has an insurmountable mathematical ceiling. A chimpanzee troop of 50 individuals must spend upwards of 20% of its waking daylight hours purely grooming to maintain social cohesion. As early hominids moved into open environments, gathered into larger defensive bands of 80, 100, or 150 individuals, the time required for physical grooming exceeded the total hours of the day. A group that spent all its daylight hours picking ticks would starve, fall victim to predators, or fail to gather enough calories. It was at this critical demographic juncture that vocal grooming emerged as a miraculous evolutionary adaptation. Vocal grooming allowed a single individual to groom 3, 4, or 5 companions simultaneously through acoustic contact, using soothing, rhythmic murmurs, shared laughter, chorused humming, and affectionate tonal greetings, while their hands remained entirely free to scrape hides, crack nuts, or shape wood. Watch the camp in the heat of midday. Under the shade of an acacia grove, several mothers and adolescents sit together, working strips of animal sinew. They do not maintain physical contact, but the air between them is alive with a continuous, undulating stream of vocal interplay. A younger female hits a snag in her work, issuing a short, frustrated huff. An older female responds instantly with a low, cascading, sympathetic hum that eases the tension, followed by a brief, repetitive verbal cue that directs the girl's attention to the grain of the thread. Laughter breaks out, a universally shared, rhythmic laryngeal panting that releases a flood of neurochemicals across the entire circle, instantly dissolving minor interpersonal frictions that had built up during the grueling morning trek. Words and vocal tones had become the invisible glue holding together the expanding, complex human group, allowing larger communities to cooperate without fracturing into violent territorial factions. This acoustic bonding was equally transformative for the intergenerational transmission of technology. In the center of the camp, a master napper sits cross-legged before a heavy boulder, preparing to reduce a raw nodule of flint into a suite of sophisticated Acheulean hand axes. Surrounding him are two adolescent apprentices, their eyes wide with intense, unblinking concentration. The manufacturing of a bifacial symmetrical hand axe is a cognitive and physical masterclass requiring hundreds of carefully planned strikes, each executed at precise angles with variable force. To teach this through silent modeling alone is extraordinarily slow and fraught with catastrophic errors that waste precious raw material. The master lifts a hard hammerstone in his right hand, balancing the flint cord delicately on his leather-clad thigh with his left. He does not remain silent. As he inspects the platform of the rock, running his calloused thumb over the edge, he issues a rhythmic instructional vocal cadence. Before each strike, he matches the movement of his arm to a rising vocal meter, a steady ha, where the explosive release of breath precisely coincides with the percussive impact of the stone hammer on the core. The apprentice listens not just to the explanation, but to the pitch of the strike. A dull thud indicates a poorly struck mass that risks shattering the core, while a high-pitched, metallic ping signals that a pristine, razor-sharp concholoid flake has detached cleanly from the face. When an apprentice reaches out with an incorrect grip, the master catches his wrist, producing a sharp clicking admonition paired with an exaggerated drawn-out vowel that mimics the dragging angle the boy ought to use. Through this dense fusion of acoustic rhythm, tonal correction, and concrete labeling, human culture ceased to be an accidental byproduct of trial and error. It became a cumulative, transmissible heritage. Knowledge could now be captured, encoded in memory through the scaffolding of vocal markers, and passed unbroken from parent to child across generations, forging a resilient chain of shared survival that elevated a vulnerable ape above every competitor on the Pleistocene Earth.
Deep in the damp, sheltering recess of a limestone cavern, night falls like a heavy curtain over the Pleistocene world. Outside the cave mouth, the pitch-black wilderness belongs entirely to the megafauna. The saber-toothed cat stalking through the shadows, the cave hyena prowling the ridges, and the biting glacial wind howling across the tundra. But here, inside the ring of illuminated stone, a single blaze of orange and crimson fire pushes back the darkness, casting long, dynamic silhouettes against the rocky walls. Around this hearth sits a circle of Homo sapiens. They are not merely resting their exhausted limbs after a brutal day of tracking game. They are participating in a profound cognitive and evolutionary event that will forever alter the destiny of life on Earth. A transformation of unimaginable significance has taken place within their brains and bodies, turning the raw, percussive vocalizations of their ancestors into a fluid, rapid, and infinitely generative tapestry of true modern language. At the molecular heart of this evolutionary leap were a series of delicate genetic refinements, most famously exemplified by mutations in the FOXP2 gene and its surrounding regulatory networks. While not a singular language gene that created speech out of thin air, FOXP2 acted as a critical biological master switch. It orchestrated the intricate wiring of the basal ganglia, the motor cortex, and the cerebellum, the deep neurological structures responsible for rapid, unconscious motor sequencing. For an animal to speak modern language, it cannot simply possess the right throat bones, it must execute extraordinarily fast, millimeter-precise muscular choreography. The brain must coordinate more than 100 distinct muscles across the lungs, diaphragm, larynx, pharynx, soft palate, jaw, tongue, and lips in rapid, uninterrupted succession. Prior to these neurological refinements, vocalizing a multisyllabic phrase was a slow, deliberate physical effort akin to an inexperienced child carefully learning to step across slippery river stones. With the emergence of modern neuroplasticity and motor tuning, the speed of articulation skyrocketed to 5, 6, or even 8 distinct syllables every single second. The human vocal tract became a high-speed acoustic synthesizer. Bring the lens intimately close to the face of a young storyteller seated at the fire's edge, speaking to the gathered circle. The flickering firelight carves deep highlights across the smooth, high curve of her forehead and the subtle bridge of her nose, features devoid of the heavy brow ridges of older hominids. Her mouth is a masterclass in dynamic biomechanics. As she begins her narrative, her lips do not merely pull back in blunt, static postures, they ripple with breathtaking agility. The tip of her tongue strikes the alveolar ridge behind her upper teeth with a light, crisp tap to produce a dental consonant, instantly retracts into the center of her mouth to shape an open vowel, and then presses its muscular blade against the soft palate to choke off the airstream into a velar stop, all within a fraction of a heartbeat. Watch her throat. The thyroid cartilage rises and falls in micro-movements, tightening and loosening the delicate vocal folds across the descending air column with sub-millisecond precision. Air from her lungs is continuously metered by the fine motor control of her rib cage, creating a steady stream of acoustic power that she carves into acoustic waves of varied frequencies. Her eyes sparkle with intent, her eyebrows lifting slightly to signal an upcoming question, her head tilting in perfect synchrony with the melodic stress of her words. She is no longer limited to blunt declarations of here and now. Her vocal machinery has become so agile that sound has effectively detached from physical strain, becoming an effortless, transparent vessel for pure thought. Along with this motor speed came the profound cognitive breakthrough of recursive syntax, the mental capacity for what linguists call merge. For hundreds of thousands of years, early hominids were limited to flat associative chains of meaning: lion, running, river. But now, inside the expanding prefrontal cortex and the densely networked pathways of the arcuate fascicles, human brains unlocked the ability to nest concepts inside other concepts infinitely. The hunter who killed the red stag near the frozen bend in the river told us that the wolves are returning tonight. By mastering hierarchical syntax, human thought broke out of its linear cage. Language became a generative engine capable of creating an infinite number of unique sentences and ideas out of a finite set of acoustic sounds. This cognitive spark transformed the social function of the nighttime hearth. Anthropological studies show that throughout human history, daytime conversation was predominantly economic and transactional, planning the hunt, dividing foraging routes, resolving immediate disputes, and managing the physical work of survival. But when night fell and the daylight tasks ceased, the campfire fundamentally altered human consciousness. In the light of the flames, freed from the urgent pressures of subsistence, speech transformed into storytelling. The storyteller at the fire leans forward, her voice dropping into a low, hypnotic register that commands the absolute silence of the room. She does not talk about the meat currently roasting on the embers. She speaks of events that occurred 3 moons ago on the other side of the distant mountains. She speaks of a legendary mammoth hunt conducted by an ancestor who died long before anyone sitting in the circle was born. She speaks of the invisible spirits that inhabit the thunderclouds rolling over the northern peaks, and she issues precise instructions for what the younger hunters must do when the first snows of the coming winter touch the plains. This is the miracle of linguistic displacement, the extraordinary ability of the human voice to communicate about things that are not physically present, things that occurred in the distant past, things that might happen in a hypothetical future, or things that exist purely in the boundless landscapes of the imagination. For the first time in the history of life on our planet, an organism could transmit complex simulated realities directly from one mind into another. A young hunter who had never encountered a pack of cave lions could sit in the warmth of the cave and simply by listening to the textured, descriptive words of an elder, acquire the mental maps, danger signs, and behavioral strategies necessary to survive a future encounter. Language became an evolutionary shortcut of monumental power. allowing our species to inherit accumulated lifetimes of survival experience without having to endure the lethal trial and error of individual physical encounters. Through this narrative expansion, the vocal cords of early humans constructed the invisible architecture of human culture. Words were forged to describe abstract moral concepts that leave no physical footprint in the fossil record: courage, betrayal, obligation, kinship, and sacred duty. Around the fire, the band used speech to negotiate complex social taboos, to mourn their dead with poetic elegies that acknowledged their own inevitable mortality, and to bind multiple disconnected families into massive, cooperative tribal networks through shared mythology and shared ancestry. While a solitary band of 20 Neanderthals had to rely exclusively on the physical muscle and immediate ingenuity of its living members, a community of modern humans could summon the collective, distributed intelligence of hundreds of people spanning multiple generations, united by a common spoken dialect and a shared web of mythic belief. Consider the profound fragility and breathtaking improbable beauty of this evolutionary journey. 2 million years ago, our ancestors were vulnerable, thin-skinned bipeds walking the African savanna, lacking the razor-sharp claws of big cats, the bone-crushing jaws of hyenas, the thick insulating fur of woolly rhinos, or the overwhelming brute strength of the megafauna that surrounded them. By every physical metric of nature, they were prey. Yet, nature solved their vulnerability not by gifting them thicker hides or sharper fangs, but through an anatomical and cognitive realignment of breath, bone, and brain. The slow descent of a voice box in the throat, the delicate suspension of a floating U-shaped bone beneath the tongue, the rewiring of motor cortex circuits to link the agility of the hand with the acrobatics of the vocal tract, and the quiet mutation of regulatory genes paved the way for something entirely unprecedented. The simple expulsion of air from the lungs, passed through vibrating tissue and shaped by the muscular dance of the lips and tongue, became a medium capable of carrying love, strategy, memory, art, science, and reverence. Sound ceased to be a simple biological alarm and became the cradle of civilization itself. Through the power of the spoken word, a defenseless, shivering ape conquered the darkness of the Pleistocene, outlasted every rival species on the planet, and stepped forward into history to claim the Earth as its voice. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing human history stories. See you in the next video.